that's the kind of discussion we want to have, is about, you know, it's about super funds and about the ways that we understand the contracts and systems that keep mandatory detention going, and how can people individually but also collectively disrupt, you know, and break those contracts and make it be meaningful.
The first person who's going to speak, if you're ready, is Thompson.
Okay. All right. I'm going to talk, I suppose, just a little bit about the decision-making process in terms of, you know, when I left Manus Island. I'm not going to talk about what happened on Manus, because if people want to read about it, it's publicly available. I don't think it's really necessary to kind of go through that gruesome detail again. It's kind of all out there. When all the shit went down on the 16th and 17th of February, you know, the response of kind of all the migration agents and, you know, Salvation Army staff and people like that was like, oh my God, this is horrible, we should go back into the detention centre and pat people on the head and, you know, tell them we care and that kind of stuff. And that was a lot of the automatic response from a lot of staff who were working there. And in consultation with people like Angela and Sanmati and others that I was speaking to, you know, there was a lot of pressure to do certain things, you know, in response. Like, you know, I had conversations with people from the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre who wanted me to speak to media, you know, while I was there and, you know, tell them what I'd seen and give eyewitness accounts, which I couldn't give because I didn't see most of what actually happened, as if that was the way to respond to this situation, was just to try to insert yourself in the media cycle, imagine that this is going to be an issue for a few days and then think it's going to go away. And so, you know, I came back from Manus and went on Dateline and talked about the process that I was in, which was the, you know, refugee status determination stuff, and broke the contract that I had in terms of keeping that information confidential, in terms of imagining my role as if the guys there really desperately needed refugee status determination processing to happen, rather than imagining that what actually needed to happen is we need to find ways to shut Manus Island, you know, to close down the detention centre. You know, there's been a whole variety of people who've decided to break their contracts by, you know, breaking their confidentiality agreements by coming out and speaking about what's happened on Manus Island or writing submissions to the Senate inquiry. But the guys themselves have also, since what happened, since Reza Barati was murdered, they have also decided, even though their main demand for a long time was, you know, we want to get the refugee status determination process happening. And there were protests in order to facilitate that. In fact, it's one of the reasons we were brought onto the island earlier. But now they understand what it is, they understand what their role is in it, they understand that they're supposed to be completely powerless and just engage in the process that they've been given, and now they're refusing. Like, they are breaking their contract and refusing to work with the refugee status determination providers, the company, the migration agents who've been sent to them by the Department of Immigration. And they're refusing, they're doing their small thing to try to stop the place functioning. You know, they're supposed to just be helpless and hopeless and engage in the process and hope for a positive outcome, and a whole bunch of people are just like, I don't believe in this process anymore. And there's about half of the guys who've done interviews about refugee status determination who are now just refusing to participate. They don't want to speak to the lawyers, they don't want a process, they're not interested in the outcome. And I think that's what we really want to get out of this meeting, is talking to people, helping people to kind of understand, you know, have a different concept of how capitalism functions, have a sense of how these contracts work, how mandatory detention is not just, you know, a decision of government, but an industry that can be intervened in and disrupted at various points in ways that, you know, the guys on Manus are refusing to play their part. There's a variety of people who are refusing to continue their role by breaching their employment contracts. And, you know, I think, you know, I think there'll be people who talk about the Biennale later on, and that process of, you know, individual artists, yes, acting collectively, but starting with the individual contracts they have, you know, and breaking those and trying to imagine a way of breaking individual contracts. We're used to kind of thinking of collective action as, you know, enterprise bargaining and, you know, people sitting in a big union meeting room and making a decision to do. But actually what's happened with Manus has been, and with the Biennale and those kind of things, has been individuals breaking individual contracts. One other thing I wanted to just mention in that sense is the difficulty that people within the camps have had since the Labor government brought in the kind of character provision. So if you do something naughty in detention, you can now be refused a visa on the basis of failing the character test. In the Woomera and Baxter period, you had a lot of, you know, very kind of traditional, I suppose, large hunger strike actions, people refusing to go to meetings, things like that. Now the risk is individualised. Now you can risk individually your visa by taking any action within the camps, and so the process that the guys on Manus are going through, which is refusing to engage in refugee status determination, they're having to work out ways of individually taking that extraordinary risk of maybe never getting a fucking visa.
So what I want to try and do for now is just something really basic and just describe what the experience of the Biennale boycott looked from my perspective. I've been following the Cross-Border Operational Matters blog. Eventually when Angela posted the entry on Transfield's involvement with the Biennale, I remember the graphics in particular strike me because they're the three islands, Manus, Nauru, and then Cockatoo Island. I work as a design history tutor at a Pathways institution in Sydney, and we received some marketing for the Biennale a day or so afterwards, and again the reaction was kind of visceral. My feeling at the time was that I really did not want to be put into a position where I would be taking my students to an event that was being funded by a company that runs detention centres. The simple act at the time was just to put out a collective email to my other colleagues to say, I don't think we should go to this, and here are my reasons why. In fact, I think we should actually all make a deliberate effort not to go to this thing and probably tell other people why we're doing that. And then I let Angela know about that because I thought she might be interested, and then Angela suggested that we publish that email on the blog, and that's kind of when it went public. It started to get tweeted around and pushed around on social media, and an amazing array of other people kind of picked it up, and kind of the idea for the boycott kind of kicked off from there.
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess my involvement in the Biennale boycott was fairly peripheral, but I was kind of like around in the background of some of those decision-making processes and some of those events. One thing that Angela said the other night that I think is really relevant in terms of like framing who gets, who and where these tactics get directed at, is that it's not trying to convince people of the horrors of mandatory detention, but it's really trying to pick out people who already sometimes have publicly made commitments that they believe mandatory detention is wrong, and have the potential to have that kind of visceral reaction that I think you described, Matt, and I think that a lot of the artists had in realising their own kind of complicity and kind of connecting up their pre-existing beliefs with what their kind of contractual involvement. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of artists and the Biennale felt like the Biennale was the suitable place to describe or to take on the issue of mandatory detention. I think that sort of discussion is going to become even more intensified with questions about the SIC, and it's going to become even more intensified with questions about the NTEU and UniSuper, and the ways that UniSuper has an ethical stream which people have already been moving into, and people feel like they've taken action on that. I think engaging with all these different ways that people claim to have already taken action is really important. I think there are likely to be a lot of claims of
division, and that kind of boycott strategies will divide the movement. And I think some of those cropped up in the Biennale because they were trying to figure the Biennale as being part of some sort of critique, even though that is kind of astounding given its kind of complicity and profit that it generates for the border industrial complex. But I think those things are going to be stronger if they're taking on, or if boycott strategies are moving towards things that people see as much more aligned with refugee and asylum seeker politics. And I think the best way is to really preempt those criticisms by by finding out exactly what people have said, or like exactly the kinds of values that people have espoused, and holding them accountable to their own values. And I think that's potentially a really powerful way to call people out and to mobilise a bit of shame. I think, you know, I mean, like if it's pain that we want to cause to companies like Transfield, and people who are really directly complicit, then, you know, maybe, you know, a bit of shame to people who aren't, you know, acting according to their own values and according to the kind of image they put out there of themselves, is kind of in order.
We can kind of put our heads together in discussion around how precisely we can call people to account, because I think this is the next stage of where we need to be going with a campaign that was opened up with the moment of the Biennale boycott.
Hi everyone, my name's Shanmati. I'm from Melbourne. There was a sense of real momentum that was generated. People were, as I imagine Stob were describing earlier today regarding the Villawood protests, there was a real sense of the potential for action, like the potential for action had been created. So there was a lot of movement and a lot of impulses that came to the fore within Beyond Borders itself, but also people who wanted to come into Beyond Borders as it seemed like, you know, the hub of activity. The energy that went into the Biennale boycott from the artists and from people who were calling for the boycott and things surrounding it are not disconnected from the conflicts and questions that arose internally within Beyond Borders as to how do we do politics? What is the conception of the political that's being brought to bear in this moment of organising around the border? And I think that what seemed like the individual emergence of personal beefs and you know, kind of conflicts and individual clash between personalities was actually the coming to the fore of what it looks like to do politics in this sphere, and what it has looked like in Australia for a very long time now. After much discussion and hand-wringing, and after the boycott was successful, Beyond Borders has arrived at a sort of position that nobody represents Beyond Borders. Beyond Borders is decentralised, that its purposes are not necessarily known in advance, that it's an unfolding process that's in momentum. And I think that that emerged out of the result of the Biennale boycott, which is to say that I think slowly that group is arriving at a position that the way that politics around the border have been done within Australia, predominantly by citizens, has been deeply problematic and deeply depoliticising of the only persons for whom there is a real stake in the questions of the border, that is people who are illegal, people who do not have visas, people who are subjected to the border regime in different ways. And so there has been a real division between what it is that a so-called refugee movement sees as being efficacious and what actually is happening to people in their lives. To do a politics that is directed towards, for example, you know, like problematics that are set up fundamentally by the state, such as consciousness raising, you know, appealing to the underlying morality of the electorate, you know, about questions of illegality and detention, by appealing to the innate goodness of our representatives whom we validate through an electoral process. You know, these questions end up binding politics into the very frameworks that are set up by the state, and in turn replicate the subject position of people who seek asylum as fundamentally outside of the political, as people who are inagentic, people who are recipients, people whose entire action, so an entire realm of human experience is described outside of the political. You know, people's very attempts at movement and negotiation are rendered invisible within this vision of how a politics of the border should look like. So I think the decision to not, for example, have designated speakers who attend protests and advance a line, who, you know, do not engage in sort of branding of an organisation or a movement as though it is the centre of what constitutes the political in discussions of the border is a very small attempt to make that group always foremost attentive to where movement is happening and what the political implications of that are, rather than setting the agenda in advance on terms that are set up by the state.
I think that really this sort of call to boycott, wherever there was organisation, I think that from the very beginning, that sort of artists or within the organisation sort of started to organise. I think that's a kind of, in a way, an enacting of a boycott. I mean, like, you know, we are all entangled in a way in capitalism, and so it's very difficult to go. And I think you could go to the sponsors and pick out quite a few other nasty sort of examples. But it's not just this sort of, it's how we negotiate, I think, this entanglement. So it's like, who do we give agency to when there's a necessity to kind of give agency? When people start to talk and the community starts to kind of protest around something. Although there were artists that withdrew, I still feel that there were artists who acted, you know, in a way which was about bringing in those voices and, you know, allowing for the debate to happen. Like we said in the previous forum, we didn't need 50 artists to walk away to make that happen.
Really, the kind of boycott and divestment strategies begin with are the people who say they are opposed to these systems, right? It's not necessarily in the first instance about people who support these systems. It's about people who say they don't, and therefore the question then becomes, well, given these kind of systems that you're implicated in, what are you doing about it? And the two things that came up in Melbourne discussions were, the first one was the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre's partnership with the National Australia Bank. And the National Australia Bank is one of the largest shareholders of Transfield. The next one that kind of has emerged is around the NTU and superannuation funds. Not simply because the NTU has representation on the board of UniSuper, but also because the NTU has a policy against mandatory detention. And also because a lot of academics claim to be against mandatory detention. So the question then is, well, what are they doing about it? Academics who spend a lot of time talking about refugee issues or asylum seeker issues, but then there is no kind of follow through in terms of actually a practical action other than maybe going to a rally, which there's no evidence that the strategies that have been pursued by the left have actually changed anything, even though they keep pursuing the same strategies. And organising around this issue isn't about calling yourself a refugee activist, because I don't know what that means if you're not a refugee, other than claiming that you are active on behalf of refugees. And I think the inability of the left to think through the politics of those claims is a serious kind of concern, right? So really the kind of boycott, divestment, disruption strategy isn't about saying we stake a claim on various territory or representational claims. It's about saying, well, what are we actually doing about these issues? It's not about what do you claim, it's about what you're doing in practice.
There's a lot of stuff that may be sounding slightly opaque, and that's probably a function of the fact that we have spent a lot of time talking to each other, both face-to-face and over social media and that kind of thing. But as Angela says, a lot of the stuff is actually simpler than it looks. So the opportunity here now is to open it up to direct questions and also to thinking together about how we can move things forward in a practical and concrete sense, I think.
I'm interested in the ways that the 19 BOS working group kind of navigated those differences between the decisions that various people made, right? In terms of, and continue to support each other through that process, right? Because not, as you say, not everybody pulled out. But you spend a lot of time talking to each other.
You know, like this is how you negotiate. You come up against a group of people who have very diverse, points of view. I mean, everyone had a different position. You're invested in something because you're involved in it. It doesn't matter what you're kind of working at, whether it is art or it is in the legal service or whatever. You know, you have to negotiate all these kind of structures, and some of them are bureaucratic as well. So the other aspect of it is this 24-hour media cycle as well. After the Melbourne meeting, we were offered someone wanted to be a publicist, wanted to offer their services. And there was this discussion in the group. I said, no, there's no way. Like, once we start going down this track of kind of really shaping an image, we stop acting, independently or sporadically, and it becomes more of a calculated thing.
The way I kind of conceptualised it initially was that there was, if we couldn't get everyone to leave, there was no point. It wouldn't make any difference to have one person leaving. And what was really interesting about that, of course, is that the person who ended up kind of being the person who was like, no, absolutely, this is where we have to leave, this is ridiculous, like this is the department trying to use us to demonstrate that Operation Sovereign Borders will roll over as many bodies as they have to in order to achieve that, that aim of deterrence, was actually the person who has very, very different politics to me, and all of the other people on the team were, lefty, bleeding heart migration lawyers. you know, these are all, it's like the Salvation Army staff who work there. They're not fascists, yeah? Like, they certainly don't, they think of themselves as well-meaning people, and they didn't see how they could do anything. The one thing I continue to have a real problem with when people talk about Manus, and there's this line that, you know, there were no protests on Monday, you know, people were just attacked. There were fucking protests on Monday. Like, there were protests in Oscar Compound, I saw them myself. There's no need to frame people as fucking innocent victims in order to talk about what happened on Manus, yeah? And that's one of the real problems with white leftists speaking on behalf of refugees is, you know, this moral economy of innocence and victimhood and whatever else is the only way to get. Like, it's a real problem. And, you know, one of the biggest problems with Manus is there's all these inquiries and there's going to be legal actions, and people know that there was protests on Monday night. And that's fine, you know? Like, there's no need to bullshit about that in order to be able to call what happened to Reza Barati murder, and in order to be able to pin that blame on the department. Like, it's pretty okay for people to protest about their conditions, and we don't have to fudge that or disappear it in order to have solidarity. It's not just a bit awkward, it's really undermining the strategies that people on Manus are using to talk to people about what their situation is. So.
I just do think that this raises something important that we haven't necessarily touched on yet, which is how we have to understand this within a general racialised regime, whereby black people's protest becomes illegitimate. Okay, and then the reasons for murdering them are made legitimate, right? And then the fear of the white left in actually saying, well, there was a protest, the fear is that you know, the answer will be, well, it was legitimate to murder him because he was protesting. So if we take the example, the most recent one that comes to mind from the UK, young black man Mark Duggan, who was shot down by police, and I had people say to my face, well, you know, I don't care really what happened to him because one less guy like that on the streets is better for me and my family. And these were people who considered themselves leftists. Okay, and I think it's within the same context, and you have to think about the hookup between this and stuff around the code of conduct, hitting people in the community. Okay, where then it says, yeah, but you know, the guy is X, you know, he's a criminal, or he's this, or he's that, and it's usually, you know, gendered as well. So we have to think about ways in which, you know, all of these things have to be understood in the round as part of this kind of deeply racist and racialized regime. So that needs to be at the forefront of our minds when we're discussing the strategies.
I'm Sam Russell. I'm an NTU National and State Councillor on a branch at UNSW. So if people think that would be disruptive to their open conversation, just ask me to go. I'm happy with that. Like,
No,
Sorry,
not enough.
well, one of the issues is with UniSuper, there's an intense level of age conflict within the industry because UniSuper works on largely trying to keep people at kind of their terminal income level. So most people's super funds work like a bank account that you never control and barely get to use. UniSuper works more like if you exited at this income, you always end up with something like this compared to somebody who's, you know, a library stacker.
Sorry, but I'm not unsure. I'm not unsure the implication.
Well,
in this context.
NTU has some problems with refugees. We have lovely policy. We have little action. Members have problems. They have lovely ideas. They have little action. UniSuper has problems with the members, but members view UniSuper as, will it last? Does it work? Is it any good? But this is one of the reasons why it's nicer to work in higher ed than in other industries, because of the way super has been set up in the past. So it's like, where do you push the lever to get people to act on their lovely lefty statements? Particularly when NTU as an organisation doesn't have great control over its membership. You know, we don't do educational campaigns with our members. And we've got very little control over UniSuper because the board is stacked by the bosses. So
look. Superannuation is a scam. You know, the more I look at this, it's a complete scam. Okay, they have basically sequestered. They have privatised retirement, and they've sequestered that money to become a trough for corporations. That's what's going on. But there are two levers that we've kind of identified so far, and I'm sure there are actually more. The first is what I mentioned before about academics who claim to have made careers on this issue, for example, right? And NTU also similarly claims to have a decent position on this issue, but have done nothing. But the other one is a kind of is a much nerdier one in terms of finance and kind of how dodgy, completely dodgy the system is. Okay, there's Alan Gray, which is a fund manager. They're the second largest shareholder in Transfield. They manage a whole lot of funds like CBUS and UniSuper. So basically, that's Transfield, TSE, right? So they manage funds, but they're also invested in the same company. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
that in itself to me speaks like that's dodgy shit, right? Yeah? That's like pretending you're managing somebody's funds with prudence, but you're actually investing it in the company, yeah? NAB, once we introduce NAB into the mix as well, who's also a major shareholder, they currently, and they're doing it again, they have another bond issue in the US market, which they bundle Transfield debt. That's Transfield debt. How do we do that? With super funds, right? And they use super funds as collateral. They bundle these two things and they sell them off in the bond market to pay off Transfield's debt. So there's the issue of like academics who don't do shit but pretend that they're hip. And there's the issue, and unions similarly, but there's also the issue of this is a completely unstable system, right? This is high risk debt bundled together with people's retirement incomes being used as collateral. So they're not simply investing that money into Transfield, they're also using it to basically collateralise the debt, Transfield's debt. If those super funds are actually doing their job, they should be paying attention to this because this is serious shit, right? But also, this is dodgy. It's like a cosy little arrangement. You know? And the other one is the kind of targeting academics who actually, you know. But if you have any other ideas,
Yeah, okay. Is that?